Hudson Taylor, he said that God's work done in God's way will not lack God's supply. God is not dead. He's got plenty of money, and he will meet your needs. You don't want to go to the government when it particularly will be a threat to the autonomy and freedom of Christian education and homeschooling. So please reach out to your politicians there in Tennessee.
You're listening to Faith in Action. I'm your host, Matthew Nowland.
And I'm Sean Green.
We lead Conservative Christians of Tennessee, and we are thankful you're joining us today. Conservative Christians of Tennessee exists to analyze political policy and politicians in Tennessee, and all from a conservative Christian worldview. We want to glorify God by helping you to glorify God, so please don't hesitate to send us any questions or any comments via email. You can reach me directly by emailing matthew@tnchristian.com.
Or Sean, SHAWN, @tnchristian.com.
Today's show is brought to you in the Memphis area by Herbie Systems. Give Herbie Systems a call at 901-451-8214 for all your lawn care needs. Since 1984, Herbie Systems has been the premier lawn care and landscape company in the Mid-South. So give Herbie Systems a call today. That's 901-451-8214, or visit herbiesystems.com and let them kill your weeds. Our scriptures for today are from Deuteronomy, the 6th chapter, verses 4 through 12. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. And thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy might. And these words which I command thee this day shall be in thine heart. And thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children, and shalt talk of them when thou sittest in thine house, and when thou walkest by the way, and when thou liest down, and when thou risest up. And thou shalt bind them for a sign upon thine hand, and they shall be as frontlets between thine eyes. And thou shalt write them upon the posts of thy house and on thy gates. And it shall be, when the Lord thy God shall have brought thee into the land which he sware unto thy fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give thee great and goodly cities, which thou buildest not, and houses full of all good things, which thou fillest not, and wells digged, which thou diggest not, vineyards and olive trees, which thou plantest not. And when thou shalt have eaten and be full, then beware lest thou forget the Lord, which brought thee forth out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. Listeners, we are a week into the new year, and already the Tennessee legislature is abuzz with talks of a potential special session to cram the governor's so-called school choice agenda into our state. We're also calling it socialized private schooling. Even if the special session doesn't happen, the bill has been filed, and we find ourselves facing the cancer of socialist takeover of private education in our state for the second year in a row. For any listeners that might be unclear, we have opposed, and we opposed this idea this year. We'll continue to oppose the socialist takeover of private schools, socialized private schooling by Governor Bill Lee, and you should too. The state is failing to provide a proper education, and now they are doubling the costs of that failure. This takes the form of a bribe as they send it to you, the citizen, but they want you to think it's your money, so they call it a voucher. Folks, this is a shell game. It will usher in a socialist takeover of all Christian education in Tennessee. Do you want dozens of new Muslim-based education choices to get your tax money? Because everywhere this plan has started, that's exactly what we have seen. Once we open this box, your money will then fund private Muslim or Satanist schools across our state, and your elected representatives know this. Let's consider the logic behind this school scam for a second. Our leaders are repeating the word choice so much they sound like Democrats, but what they are not telling you is the costs and the results. These are real facts and issues they want you to ignore. We know the costs are going to double per student if they enact this, because you will be paying for each kid's education twice. Yes, you hear me correctly. In Tennessee, you will pay for kids who leave, and you will continue to fund the failing school they left. And from the results we have seen coming out of the test schools in Shelby County, the kids that do participate in this end up scoring even lower on their TCAP testing than when they end up in these paid private schools. Listeners, those of us who claim to be conservative need to think on this for a second. If a bridge fell apart and people were dying because the state failed to do its job, would you take an $8,000 bribe from the state to go build your own bridge? No, of course not. You know there is no way you can build anything like it for $8,000, so of course you'd never do that. You would hold the state leadership accountable to do their job and build the roads and infrastructure that your taxes paid for. So why don't we hold our state leaders accountable for the failure of public schools in Tennessee? No matter how big the bribes are, this is theft from other citizens. The failure of our government to deliver a quality education to students is not an excuse to socialize private schools. So call your officials. Tell them this school choice scam is a seventh commandment violation, and you don't want our private Christian schools taken over by this socialist program. And listeners, I'm excited for our guest today. Colonel Ray Moore has served over 40 years in pastoral ministry as a campus pastor, a congregational minister, an Army chaplain, and a director of Christian ministry. Additionally, he has served as a campaign consultant for several major political campaigns, including former Vice President Dan Quayle's first Senate race in 1980 and Pat Robertson's presidential campaign. Colonel Moore is married to Gail. They have 4 children and 7 grandchildren. He and Gail have had a long time involvement in private Christian education and homeschooling. Ray is the co-founder of Frontline Ministries Incorporated and Exodus Mandate, which is an amazing project of Frontline Ministries focusing on reaching American Christians. Ray is the author of the excellent book, Let My Children Go, also the study on Christian family legacies, The Promise of Jonadab. Colonel Moore also authored many other articles, interviews, films, and videos. Colonel Moore, welcome to Faith in Action. It is a privilege to have you.
Thank you, Matthew, and good to meet you, Sean, and glad to meet again Vern Bearden's son-in-law. He was my good friend and my coordinator in Alabama until he passed, and was one of the very first people that encouraged me in this ministry. I think I had started it about a few months, and I hadn't talked to anybody much about it, and met him at a Republican state convention, and he had a table right next to mine, and he was marketing the 10 Commandments yard signs, and I was just beginning to sell the idea of Exodus Mandate. So you don't forget people like Vern, who were the first people to encourage you that you were doing the right thing.
We miss him. It's been 10 years, and I remember very much the privilege of hearing about people like you from him, people in the homeschooling movement. And that brings us to our first question. You and your family have been on the front lines of the Christian political movement for a few years now. And unlike a lot of people, you came to realize that Christian education was something that had to be focused on. How were you able to latch onto this when so many people missed it?
First of all, it was a matter of God's providence. It wasn't that I had any strong, abiding theological views at the time. My wife and I were in Indiana, and I was finishing up my theological seminary training at Grace Seminary in Winona Lake, Indiana. And I had done everything but the thesis. I had no classwork, and we moved down to Purdue University campus to start a evangelical campus ministry right on the campus. You know, we're a block away. We had a big house, and we had a church in our basement for students at Purdue. And my 6-year-old son was getting ready to go into the first grade, and we weren't sure what we were going to do with his education. We knew we weren't going to put him in a public school, but at that time, our aversion to the horrors of public education were not as pronounced as they are today. So we looked at a couple of local Christian schools, but they were financially difficult for us, and we didn't honestly feel they were academically rigorous enough. So we prayed and felt led to start a family school, we call it. We didn't call it homeschool. My son was 6 years old at the time, old enough to know that it was weird. And I still remember him saying, "Mommy and Daddy, don't do this to me," because he knew he wasn't going to be going to school like normal kids did. And we said, well, we're going to take it 1 year at a time. If it doesn't work, we'll put you in school. Well, it worked so well that he was satisfied after 1 year that he was learning more than the 3rd and 4th graders in the neighborhood. So he never complained after that. But that was how we got started. There were no books written on it at the time. We read a chapter in a book called Sketches of Jewish Social Order by the great Hebrew Jewish Christian scholar Edersheim. And there was a chapter in there about the New Testament model of education for Jesus when he was a boy. And I guess he was homeschooled up to 12 years old. So we thought, well, if Jesus could do it, our oldest son could do it. So that's how we got started. And didn't know another family for 4 or 5 years. And so we think we're among the first families in Indiana. The State Department of Education found out about us and called us and wanted to know why we were doing that. And we told them that if they couldn't show that we were harming our child they had no right to interfere. So they called back, I think, a week later and asked us, would my wife and I help them develop a homeschool permission form? I said, well, we don't mind helping you develop a homeschool notification form, but not permission, because it's not yours to give permission. That we get permission from God, but we'll help you with a notification form. Well, that was the last we ever heard of them. We just kept right on doing it, and here we are today. That was 1980 when they called us. So we're way beyond that now, 40 years later. And our kids are grown. Actually, I have to update my bio. I have 9 grandkids now, and
Congratulations.
not 7. And my wife and I have been married 55 years, and we're still both working. It's getting harder at our age, but we're still active in the ministry.
You told the government that you didn't need their permission and they went away. And that's remarkable. I see why you say God's providence was there, because over the last several years, I've gone back and I've listened to older weekly teachings from folks like R.J. Rushdoony that were contemporary to the 70s, the 80s, and even going into the early 90s, some of these recordings. And there were prayer requests at the beginning and ends of these sessions for men and women in states. Nebraska is one that comes to mind, where people were actually in protracted legal battles, in some cases went to jail for homeschooling their children. And there's a connection between that. So many men who were your contemporaries and you fought to get the government out of private education and out of home education. In Tennessee, we are in a battle right now that would see socialized private education at a minimum, and almost certainly down the road, socialized homeschooling, as we're calling it. Why is it important to keep the government out of these institutions?
Well, we take the same position for Christian education that we would take for the church. We have a separation of church and state in America. Now, that term has fallen on bad days, used by the left often to mean the exclusion of any Christian principles in government or public policy. We don't believe that. We believe there is a jurisdictional separation of church and state. The government cannot dictate to the church. The government doesn't pay our pastors. We raise our salaries through free will offerings. And this was a different American model from the European model. When the settlers first came in Europe, they left behind a church and state system, like in England, even in Germany. So I want to make very clear, I believe in a separation of church and state, but not the left-wing Marxist version. So we want to keep a jurisdictional separation. So we take the position that we want a separation of school and state. The government has no right to be dictating and controlling Christian education, because it is a role of the church and the family. Education has been assigned by the Lord to the family and the church, not government. They have no role. Now they've usurped it. And since Horace Mann, around 1840, the government began to intrude and encroach on education and set up state schools, starting in Boston, and then it spread to the rest of the United States by the turn of the 20th century. So if the government funds Christian education, they will control it eventually. All you got to remember is one illustration, and I'll hold my hand up. When you reach for the money, the handcuffs go on.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, sir.
Right now, the voucher or school choice, as it's called, has become a big policy, mostly in the red states where the Republicans dominate. And so the Democrats oppose school vouchers because they think it threatens the monopoly of public education. I personally, and I'm assuming that you do, oppose vouchers because it threatens the freedom and the autonomy of private Christian home education. And I'm a part of the Republican apparatus, the conservative movement, and I'm very distressed that some of our people who we normally would be politically allied with on family issues, abortion, marriage, are supporting school choice, which is very, very dangerous for our movement. And right now, I'm sad to tell you, we're really losing this battle, and it looks like they're going to impose it on us in the red states. And President Trump, who I appreciate so much on so many areas, he seems to be supporting the idea as well. So we have a lot to be concerned about, and your people in Tennessee need to contact your political leaders and say, look, don't throw us under the bus. That's what
Right.
you're doing. And the homeschool movement and the Christian school movement are some of the best allies politically to public Christian conservative public policy. And we're their most
Absolutely.
loyal, faithful voting constituency, and they're throwing us under the bus over this issue, thinking that they're helping us. Well, remember what Ronald Reagan said, the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. We don't want their help.
Ray, you are an inspiration to homeschoolers like myself, people like me who've been in this for a while. A lot of the influences that have influenced me in my teaching come from some of your writings and some of the people that you've worked with. In the New American Magazine, you said, if parents continue sacrificing children on the altar of government schools, the future looks bleak. But if they take back the role of guardians, a glorious future of restoration and healing is possible. I'm coming to the source here, and I got to ask you, how do we do that?
Well, the good news is, frankly, while we having to worry about the abuse of school choice and vouchers, our movement is literally exploding. Since the pandemic, I think when the pandemic came, there were about 2.6 million children being homeschooled nationally, and probably 70% of them were evangelical Christians. A lot of Catholics are doing it now, a lot of Jews, other groups that have a traditional morality. They may not be evangelical Christians or Baptists, but they share a lot of the worldview with us, are doing it as well. And so we're seeing an explosion. And then campus Christian schools are growing at a rate of 10, 20, 30, or 40% a year. My grandchildren have attended a local ACSI Christian school, which is the second largest in the state of South Carolina. And they've grown since the pandemic from about 850 to 1250 in this one school. Wow. And this is a typical growth at this time across the nation. And hundreds of new private Christian schools are forming even as I speak. Nevertheless, homeschooling is about 2.5 times bigger in numbers than private Christian schools. And there's a projection by the Learning Center that by 2030, that among all K-12 education, 30% will be in homeschooling and 20% in private Christian or parochial schools. Those wouldn't all be Christian schools. And that'll be about 50% of all children at the K through 12 level will be outside of the state system. Right now, we think it's about 13 to 15%, but it's very fluid and growing very rapidly. So we're in a kairos moment, Greek word for opportune, a divine moment to grow our movement. And so we want to be careful that we don't, snatch defeat out of the jaws of victory. We're on the verge of winning this battle, and then along come the voucher people who want to circle back around and hand us over to the government again. So please, Mr. Republican, Mr. Conservative elected official, don't throw us under the bus. We don't want your help. We don't need your help.
Amen.
So why do people not see the logical path that goes from the initial acceptance of government money to the end game? Because we've seen it in Texas. Governor Abbott has said accountability. Yeah. We've seen it in Oklahoma. They're in their second year now of school, that we have to have accountability. We're seeing accountability screamed in Arizona. We're seeing in Florida that they're angry that the money is being used to fly in radical jihadists to speak at Muslim schools. So they need accountability in Florida. I mean, everywhere this seemingly free money with no strings attached goes, the next year or the year down the road, they start talking about accountability. Why do people not see that?
I think they deceive themselves in thinking somehow it won't happen this time. It always happens. You can't defy God's law and economic law and not have repercussion. And I talk to a lot of these leaders, and when you talk to them, they kind of give you that deer in the headlights look. They say, oh, no, it won't happen here. It won't happen this time. The courts will help us. You can't take the money. And even when they, I think Arizona, maybe, I'm not sure on my detail here, but they give a voucher of, say, $6,000 or $8,000 a year to students that are, taking the voucher for private education or home education. What the schools do is they double the tuition. So you
Yes.
get a $6,000 voucher or $8,000 voucher, and it's still not enough to put your child in that school because the schools see the opportunity to raise their prices.
Right.
So you can't create another entitlement program. This is called entitlement, and
Yes.
and we don't want another entitlement. So it's a very dangerous thing. Hudson Taylor, he said that God's work done in God's way will not lack God's supply. And God is not dead. He's got plenty of money, and he'll
Amen.
meet your needs. You don't want to go to the government when it particularly will be a threat to the autonomy and freedom of Christian education and homeschooling. So please reach out to your politicians there in Tennessee. And it's a real threat in Tennessee. This is not a threat in California or Illinois or some of the New England states. It's in the red states where the Republicans have the political domination that we have to fear from our friends on this. Our political friends are the ones that are doing us in. And I have a lot of material on this, and if your people will contact me at exodusmandate.org, we can send you a series of articles digitally explaining the harm and the danger that the voucher represents for our movement.
Thank you, Ray, for doing that. Thank you for the influence you've put in this. I've got to ask you, what are you and Gail up to these days?
Well, we're just continuing on. We wrote this little book a few years ago, Promise of Jonadab. It's a short little book about an obscure Old Testament character who has what I call the greatest dad in the Bible. And if your audience can send me a little donation for it, exodusmandate.org, we can send out an autographed copy. I can send you free the digital file on vouchers. And there's more material there than you've got time to pray over, but there are serious arguments against it. And your audience needs to know that almost universally, the national homeschool leaders are opposed to the voucher. There's a homeschool state alliance, and all the 50 states meet yearly to plan and strategize. It includes people like Israel Wayne, Heidi St. John, Brian Ray. These are all some of the big national leaders that are strictly in homeschooling, and they had a secret ballot vote, maybe it was last year, and 15% of the state association leaders want the voucher, and 85% voted secret ballot against it. So the sentiment in our movement is real strong against the voucher in the homeschool movement. Sadly, a lot of the ACSI schools, which is the number one agency for Christian schools, seem to support it. So we don't have unanimity in our ranks, but we have almost unanimity in our homeschool ranks. And homeschooling is twice as big as private Christian schooling. So we've got to fight this like a deadly enemy, because when it comes in and becomes the dominant means of funding private education, within a decade, we'll have circled back around and we'll all be public schools all over again.
That's right. And especially in a society that is multicultural, there will be an effort, like Sweden recently made Christian curriculum illegal, but it wasn't necessarily a direct assault, although it did directly assault on Christianity. It was an effort to get Islam under control. They were paying to radicalize Muslims in Sweden. So
Alex Newman, who is very prominent in our movement, and you should have him on your show if you haven't already. He's one of our leading international speakers, and he is married to a Swedish girl, and he's given a lot of reports on how it was a conservative government in Sweden 15 years ago that put the voucher in. It wasn't the liberals, it was the conservatives.
That's
and
right.
So
Yes.
You look at the left, and they're wrong 95% of the time. But the Republicans and the conservatives are wrong 50% of the time. You have to watch them as well. Our friends are throwing us under the bus on this. But they say, oh, no, Ray, you're worried about something. It's not going to happen. It won't happen this time. Yes, it will happen.
You are absolutely right. Colonel Moore, you've given your website, but I want to make sure our listeners hear it again. It's Exodus, as in the book of the Bible, exodusmandate.org. You have a resources tab there. You have a contact tab there.
Yeah, they can order the book for a donation of $12, or they can order the file on vouchers a digital file, and that would be no cost at all. And if they get the file, they're free to circulate it far and wide. And particularly,
Yes, sir.
your people need to sit down with the local elected officials and say, please don't throw us under the bus. Please don't destroy our movement.
I think that is the perfect way to end the show. Thank you, Colonel Moore. Folks, that's going to do it for another episode of Faith in Action. We're thrilled each week to bring you the latest in conservative Christian news and political analysis all across the state of Tennessee and Memphis, Clarksville, Nashville, and into the surrounding states. If you would like to work with us on any of the issues we talk about, you can reach me directly, Matthew at tnchristian.com. Make sure to contact your elected officials and let them know that you oppose socialized private education. And until next week, remember, the Lord shall reign forever and ever.